Hey everybody, what is going on? Hexlex here. Got another Master Duel video for you. So, I wanted to do another one of these opinion pieces, and I got a really good opportunity to. I was actually going to do one about the TCG ban list today, but there's been a little interesting bit of discourse that I wanted to talk about. So, today, at the day that I'm recording this, tomorrow at the day this video is going out, we actually got a recent leak here on Master Duel Meta for the new Sword Soul structure deck. You know, as shown in the description, it'll contain obviously Moye, Qishao, Shengying, and Longyan. I think that's pretty obvious, right? And the kind of discourse around this leak has been pretty interesting. My first reaction when I saw this was announced was that this is great. This is phenomenal even, because I've always recommended Sword Soul as one of the best decks for players who are just getting into Master Duel, right? It's a deck that's pretty easy to pick up, but still has a pretty high skill ceiling. On top of that, it's a great entry to competitive Yu-Gi-Oh! Because the basic lines aren't too complex, but the deck still is very, very good in this particular metagame, and is definitely still capable of not only reaching Master 1, but also topping tournaments. In fact, of course, Sword Soul has done both of those things even just within this season. Now, of course, as with always as ever, you know, some Yu-Gi-Oh! Players on Twitter were talking about how, like, this wasn't a great choice for a structure deck, or how, oh, Konami can do this, but they can't put, like, you know, modern tier 1 decks in a structure deck. You know, I find that Yu-Gi-Oh! Players a lot of the time, you know, when something good and positive for especially newer players comes around, they really like to think to themselves, but how can I make this sound like a bad thing? I mean, I do agree that, like, sure, it'd be nice if, like, newer, you know, archetypes that were in structure decks were introduced in structure decks in Master Duel as well, but, you know, it's not always viable. And, again, I think this is a great choice for a structure deck, because it's a very, very good deck for newer players. But one of the other things that I saw people kind of saying about this deck is that, oh, now they're giving players Sword Soul in a structure deck now that it's bad. And I really want to epitomize this in a comment I saw on r/MasterDuel. Now, I know, it's r/MasterDuel. It's not exactly the most, what's the best way I can say this? Informed opinion. Of course, I actually know this pretty well because I made a whole video about r/MasterDuel. Go ahead and check it out. If I remember, I'll go ahead and link it in the description below. But there was one comment in particular that I saw on the thread here talking about the Sword Soul getting a structure deck that really just epitomizes to me how poorly Yu-Gi-Oh! Players evaluate decks as a whole. So if we look at the top comment, you know, from tier 1 meta deck to structure deck with no real ban list hit after 19 months. Holy, that is actually pretty interesting and worth noting. This is a good demonstration of power creep within the meta. This isn't the comment I'm talking about, though. Under that, you see Sword Soul became Salamangreat after 2 years of release. Skull emoji, haha. This is the one, and I actually made a tweet about this comment right here. Salamangreat came in as an upper rogue deck and became unplayable by Halcdon/Prank Kids format. Sword Soul is still solid, but there's no incentive to play it because it's just the it's just the third best synchro strategy right now. I don't think that this, I mean, first of all, I fundamentally, wholesale, and completely 100% disagree with literally everything that's being said here. And not only that, like I said before, I think this sentiment is the epitome of how Yu-Gi-Oh! Players are just so bad at not only just evaluating decks in the format, but respecting decks in the meta as well. I really want to talk about this and break it down, honestly. Let's start with the first half here. Salamangreat came in as upper rogue, I would agree with that, and became unplayable by Halcdon/Prank Kids format. I fundamentally 100% disagree with this, particularly the use of the phrase unplayable. Sure, this person is probably being hyperbolic, at least a little bit. Of course, like, well, I don't know, see, that's the thing. I actually genuinely can't tell if this is supposed to be hyperbole or not, because a lot of Yu-Gi-Oh! Players, even if this one person is being a little bit over-exaggerating here, I don't think a lot of players would necessarily disagree that Salamangreat is unplayable. But how bad is Salamangreat? Has it really not seen any play at all since Hulk/Prankins format? Let's pop over to Master Duel meta and find out here, if the site ever wants to load. There we go. So if I go to top decks, right, again, if the site ever wants to load here. Okay, now that Master Duel meta has finally decided to load, I don't know if anyone else has this problem where other websites load fine, but this one is always just dragging. But anyway, so, you know, if we look at, I searched up Salamangreat Sanctuary, or started to type it just to make sure we got a Salamangreat focused deck. And yeah, look at this. Wow, top 8 meta weekly, literally within, like, barely over a week ago. But yeah, sure, I mean, this deck has just totally been unplayable at all for well over a year. I think particularly the phrase unplayable by Halkdon/Prankins format, this is really telling to me because there wasn't anything in Halkdon or Prankins format that inherently made Salamangreat, like, worse or definitely unplayable. The thing that this tells me is that this is around the time this person stopped playing Salamangreat, like, and there really is this notion, too, of, like, well, Salamangreat was playable until I decided to stop playing it. Like, unironically, there's this sentiment a lot within the Yu-Gi-Oh community. It reminds me of this tweet I saw once about fighting game players, about how, like, you know, somebody who's never attended a fighting game tournament will lose to the 100th best player in the world at that game and be like, oh, I lost to them? Shit, my career is over. I think that sentiment is also expressed here a little bit, and is also just present in the Yu-Gi-Oh community as a whole. Another thing I wanted to talk about a little bit here is, of course, the latter half of the statement. Sword Soul is still solid. Okay, there's at least the acknowledgement of that. There's no incentive to play it because it's just the third best synchro strategy right now. This is a sentiment that a lot of Yu-Gi-Oh players seem to have, regardless if you're talking about Master Duel, or the TCG, or just any amount of Yu-Gi-Oh, which is a topic that's been covered a lot lately, but we definitely still need to keep covering it because people are still making just completely erroneous statements like this. There's this really weird obsession with exactly tier 1 decks in Yu-Gi-Oh! And what I mean by that is that if you try to entertain the idea that a deck that isn't tier 1 is actually not only playable, but able to do well on ranked ladder and win tournaments, you'll just get scoffed at. Again, this person right here is scoffing at the notion of playing Sword Soul because it's the third best synchro strategy. You know what the 2 synchro strategies that are better right now are? If we again go over here to Master Duel meta, it's fucking Super Heavy Samurai and Vanadium. These are both very arguably tier 1 decks. Ignore Master Duel meta's actual tier ranking. It only focuses on tournaments, blah, blah, blah. We've talked at length about this, but the other 2 quote-unquote, like, you know, better synchro decks are literally tier 1 decks. It's like, this person is literally saying there's no reason to play Sword Soul because it's not a tier 1 deck. And this is also something that I've noticed as I've been exploring Edison more lately, as I'm preparing to play in an Edison event. I noticed Hero Beat in particular. Hero Beat is a deck that's centered around Neos, Alias, Gemini Spark, and Hero Blast, right? And this is a deck that had all the tools available in Edison at the time in 2010. And now, retroactively, people have gone back and explored Hero Beat in that format and found it to be not only very playable, but also a very competitive deck. But I can tell you, as somebody who played during Edison, no one, I mean no one at all, had that combination of cards on their radar even a little bit. The only hero deck that kinda saw play was Diva Hero, which was also pretty underplayed at the time. Granted, there is the accessibility issue of Absolute Zero to think about that, but the fact that Hero Beat was not on players' radars at all is just so telling of this mentality that players have, right? And the funny thing is too, when you think about retro formats, or when players talk about retro formats, a lot of the time there's kind of this, there's this tone of like, oh, there's so many good decks in this retro meta, like how could players back then have possibly missed it? And that's how they talk about retro formats, but then when it comes to the current format, we see people saying shit like this. We still have people saying like, oh, well, I mean, sure, this deck can hit Master 1 in its top tournaments, but is that really enough to call it a good deck? And it's like, yes! Yes, it's 100% enough. But again, there's this notion, and the thing that I find kind of fascinating too is that this notion that decks that aren't tier 1 aren't worth considering is not a like snobby elitist pro player opinion like a lot of people probably assume. This is a sentiment that's shared mostly among more casual or less competitive players, but can also be shared between like more competitive players. It's really a thought process or a sentiment that is across the whole community, right? This idea that if you're not playing, like, why would you play the third best synchro deck? It's like, do you know how many fucking synchro decks there are? I think the third best one is still really good, and it is. Sword Soul is still more than capable of hitting win streaks, of topping tournaments, of getting to Master 1. Again, if you look at Master Duel meta, you will see the data that indicates that, right? All within the last few weeks as well. It's not like, oh, well, historically the deck is good. No, the deck is good right now. But again, like, just this notion that people aren't even willing to entertain the third best synchro strategy. Like, are you kidding me? Do you know how many decks play Synchro Monster? It's like, when I tweeted about this, actually, Oni Gurley in particular had a really funny response. It's like, damn, Labyrinth is the third best deck that plays trap cards. I guess it's just not worth playing right now. Of course, being totally sarcastic, but that really does feel to me to be a lot of the sentiment here. And I think that this mentality is a hindrance to the community as a whole. But it's so, like, I don't know. It's so hard to, I feel like, to get the community to let go of this idea. And indeed, how do you let a community, or how did you get a community to let go of this notion, right? That only the best decks are worth playing. I think it does really come down to how we talk about Yu-Gi-Oh! There are so many, God, I remember when I posted, when I posted my tweets about the Yu-Gi-Oh! Organization opinion piece, there were a lot of people, this article right here, right, it's pretty infamous I think by this point, there were a lot of people who really kind of bashed me bashing this article, right? A lot of people said people should be allowed to talk about the game however they want. Just because, you know, you don't think it's productive doesn't mean it isn't valid. And for one, I'm not saying it's not valid. Like, if you don't think Sword Soul is worth playing, I'm not saying your opinion is invalid. But I am saying that this kind of sentiment, the more it's shared, the more it's spread, and also the less it's challenged, the more it ends up being spread. And that's one of the big reasons that I really, really want to challenge this notion here, right? This idea, again, that like, oh, if you're not playing the best deck, it's not even worth considering. Because, again, you think about retro formats, you think about just how often we go back to any given meta and find that whatever we thought was the best deck was not the best deck. So to kind of be able to do that, but still not see the merit in entertaining more deck ideas in the current meta is just, it baffles me. It genuinely baffles me. It also baffles me because it seems to me like there are a good amount of players who want a more open or diverse meta. Again, especially among less competitive or more casual players who, again, in my experience, tend to hold this opinion, you know, more so than more competitive players. But again, it's something you do tend to see across the Yu-Gi-Oh! Meta as a whole. It almost feels self-defeatist to me, in a way, right? Because players will complain that, oh, only Super Heavy Samurai and Manadium are, like, worth playing right now. And it's like, okay, well, I mean, I think Sword Soul is still good. You could definitely still Master 1 with it. But then, you know, the same people are just complaining that, like, no, you can't do well with a deck that isn't tier 1, la 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 la, that's why I'm doing bad, la la la. I honestly think that's what it comes down to sometimes. Is that some players are kind of trying to have this notion of like, oh, well, if I can't do well with this rogue deck, then surely it's just completely unplayable. But again, I would challenge that notion, not just person to person, but in the community as a whole, right? I also think there are a fair amount of players who spend a little bit too much time jumping from tier deck to tier deck, right? it's often the players who will, you know, sit down and truly grind out a deck and really focus on it, especially less meta ones or less, you know, ones that are seen as less competitive, that'll really be able to have success with it. And again, I know that not every player can sit down with every single deck for that kind of extended amount of time to properly assess its place in the metagame, but I still think that that the vast majority of players who want to be competitive, who are holding these opinions, are the ones who are, again, also just not trying out anything that isn't one of the top 3 decks of the current format. So it's just like an insane amount of disrespect too. And when I say disrespect, I'm not like being like you're being mean to the deck. When I say disrespect, I mean just the complete denial that, like, yeah, you could do well with a deck like this. Like, again, I have stated multiple times that I would define a good deck as one that can hit Master 1 with a dedicated pilot, and possibly also with a dedicated pilot sneak in a tournament top. I think hitting Master 1 and topping tournaments is a good goal for a good deck to have. But I've had so many Yu-Gi-Oh players, when I give this definition, say, that's too loose, or that's too many decks to consider good. There aren't that many good decks. I feel like a lot of Yu-Gi-Oh players will literally only look at like the top 4 or top 8 of the most recent tournaments. And that's so flawed. That's 100% flawed logic, that good decks are topped by tournaments, and tournaments are only topped by good decks, right? It's just like, I completely disagree with that. I 100% do. But, I don't know, there's also the argument that players make of like, well, how are people possibly supposed to know except by looking at tournament tops? Again, you don't have to play and sit down and test literally every single deck. But I think playing on Master Duel Ranked Ladder does give a good insight, especially once you get to Master level, does give a good insight of what is viable within a given format. In a lot of ways, and this is another opinion that I've been clowned on before, I've said a lot of the time, not a lot of the time, but sometimes, that I prefer doing tournament testing on Ranked Ladder than with a group, because a group will never bring the total amount of decks that could feasibly be seen and also do well in that tournament. I do think there is a lot of merit to sitting down with a group and testing exactly the top 5 decks of the format, but for that to be the only experience that you get is just, I just don't think that's good enough, frankly. And I've also seen the sentiment share that, like, oh, well, but this is why a lot of players hate, a lot of top players hate open metas, because they plan for, you know, the decks that should be relevant, that should be good, and then they get blown away by decks that aren't, and it isn't fair. And it's like, well, it is fair. It's 100% fair. Like, because those decks that they're getting blown away with are equally valid in their ability to top and do well, just because they're the 3rd best synchro strategy right now. Like, I can so see, like, how often has this happened, I wondered, where, like, people will test, in the current format even, where people will test for an indie tournament against, like, Monadium, Branded, Super Heavy Samurai, VS, and Labyrinth, and nothing else, and then they'll get domed by Sword Soul in round 1 of the tournament and be like, oh, well, there's no way I could have possibly anticipated that Sword Soul would be in this tournament. It's like, well, if you kept an open mind, you probably would. But I digress. So I don't know. This is more of a ramble than even like a normal like opinion video for me, honestly. This is a little bit less organized than I typically like to have videos, but I don't know. I feel really strongly about this. And, like, as soon as I saw this comment, and especially how highly it was getting upvoted, I was like, this is, like, again, this is the epitome to me of how Yu-Gi-Oh players are just not good at all when it comes to assessing what is valid, what is viable, and what is competitive in any given meta. Even the phrase meta, like, when I say relevant to the meta, or within the meta, I mean, again, you could reasonably expect to run into this deck on Master or in a tournament. And it might even hit Master 1 or top it. It might not, but it might. But again, there's this notion that when people talk about that happened to me earlier today when I said, oh, Ninjas, I said to somebody like, oh, Ninjas and Blackwings got more meta-relevant support. And the person was like, I don't know how meta relevant it was. I mean, you know, the decks didn't like win tournaments or anything, and it's like, what are you talking about? Like, Ninja's new support and Blackwing's new support are night and day from how they played before, and absolutely made them more relevant within the meta. But again, I think this person, I think most players as a whole, think when you say the meta, you mean exactly the best 5 decks in the format. When, again, when I say meta, I'm talking, and when I talk about decks that should be respected, I'm talking about not just things that could top, but things you could, like, run into in the tournament, right? I don't know, it's just like, again, I'm not saying you have to test for every single deck if you're testing for a tournament, but at least acknowledge the possibility that, like, you could face this deck, and it could beat you. But anyway, I'm just repeating myself at this point. So, I hope you all liked this video. Again, this is a lot less organized than I like to be, so hopefully you still enjoyed it, but I think I've got my rant out now. I think that's everything I wanted to say about this particular thought I had. But what do you think about what decks are good, what decks should be considered within the meta, and just, I don't know, everything we've talked about so far? Definitely do not be afraid to let me know in the comment section below. But that's gonna go ahead and do it for this one. Let's just move now to the outro. Hey everybody, thank you so much for watching all the way to the end of the video. That means a lot to me. It's also a great way to support the channel, so thank you very much in that way as well. If you're interested in supporting the channel in other ways, like the very special patrons that I am thanking here, you can do so by checking out some of the links in the description. One of those goes to the Patreon, where you can join these fine folk and support the channel that way. I do post daily content over on Patreon, so you do get something for supporting there. And if you're interested, I also have a coaching tier option as well. Details again will be on Patreon in the link below. Also in the description linked below is my Twitch page where I stream a few times a week. You can go ahead and check that out, follow or subscribe over there if you ever want to catch me live. You'll also find my second YouTube channel if you feel like subscribing over there to watch some of the Twitch VODs as well as some additional non-Yu-Gi-Oh related content that I make over there. Again, any of those links you want to check out is all a great way of supporting. But again, even if you don't do that, just watching was also a fantastic way to support. And once again, I have to thank you so very much. But in any case, this is Hexlex. I'm going to be signing out, and I'm hoping you have a fantastic day.